Imagine waking up in the middle of the night not because your alarm buzzed, but because the cold is biting through your bones. Your breath fogs the air inside your home. There's no heat, no thermostat, no rescue coming. Just you, your family, and a fire that's almost out. If you don't feed it soon, someone might not wake up tomorrow. This wasn't a bad camping trip. This was every single winter in the medieval world. So how did they survive? Not just the freezing temperatures, but the hunger, the darkness, the silence. The answers are stranger, smarter, and far more human than you think. Because they didn't just beat winter, they outsmarted it. 1. The winter that never waited, surviving the cold as a medieval peasant. The fire is almost out. The wind claws through the gaps in the wooden walls. Your breath hangs in the air like smoke from a dying candle. And outside, winter isn't just a season, it's an adversary. One that has no patience, no mercy, and no intention of waiting for you to be ready. You're not royalty. You don't have fur-lined chambers or goose feather beds. You're a peasant. And tonight, like every night, survival isn't guaranteed. In our modern world of heated floors and thermal windows, it's easy to forget just how fragile comfort is. But for the millions who lived through the Middle Ages without electricity, thermostats, or down jackets, warmth was never taken for granted. It was engineered, choreographed, and fought for one shivering night at a time. And the way they survived wasn't magic. It was muscle, memory, community, and an intimate understanding of cold that we've all but erased. So let's walk back into that world, not to pity them, but to learn from them. Because if you were dropped into a medieval winter night with nothing but your hoodie and a vague sense of history, you wouldn't last until dawn. Not because you're weak, but because they were prepared in ways we've forgotten how to be. And that begins with the walls around you. Medieval peasant homes weren't grand, but they were clever. Many were dug 2 or 3 feet into the earth, a technique that today we'd call passive geothermal insulation. By partially submerging the home, they used the stable temperature of the ground to buffer against the biting air above. Think of it as the original earth-sheltered architecture. They didn't do it because it looked nice. They did it because a home that was half buried stayed roughly 10 degrees warmer than one built entirely on the surface. And 10 degrees when you're hovering just above freezing is the difference between sleep and hypothermia. Above ground, the homes were made of what they had, wattle and daub, a lattice of sticks coated with a thick plaster of clay, manure, and straw. It sounds primitive. It wasn't. That mix could reach our values thermal resistance comparable to modern fiberglass insulation. They packed straw into walls, hung dried animal skins over doorways, and built tiny windows designed not to bring in light, but to keep out air. Modern buildings fight for energy efficiency using computers and smart glass. They used physics instinct and the accumulated knowledge of generations who had no margin for error. And then there was the hearth, always at the center, always burning. It wasn't just a fireplace, it was the heart of the home, the clock, the stove, the heater, the altar. Everything revolved around it. And although many homes had no chimney, allowing smoke to curl into the rafters and linger for hours, this wasn't just poor ventilation, it was insulation. That low-hanging smoke warmed the air and coated the roof in a thin layer of creosote, preserving the wood and killing off pests. Of course, it also damaged lungs. But in the trade-off between immediate cold and long-term health, most peasants chose breathless warmth over clean air. They had no choice. Even the thatch on the roof changed with the seasons. Summer roofs were open and breezy. Winter thatch was packed thick, reinforced with extra layers, sometimes insulated with spare linens or even dried manure. If it smelled, it worked. And if it worked, it stayed. But the real magic wasn't just the structures. It was the people inside them. Because medieval peasants didn't survive winter by hiding in isolation. They survived by drawing close to one another, to fire, to tradition. They understood that warmth wasn't an individual achievement. It was a collective event. Every home, every hearth, every wall was part of a larger system of survival. And that's what we're going to unravel piece by piece, strategy by strategy, not as a history lesson, but as a blueprint. Because in a world where energy costs are rising, where climate extremes are increasing, and where many are once again asking, what if the power goes out? These old answers might feel new again. The cold never waited, and neither did they. 2. How medieval villagers scheduled their lives around warmth. Imagine if every hour of your day, every task you performed, every moment of rest and movement wasn't dictated by a clock but by the cold, not by productivity apps or offers, schedules, but by the sun's position and how much warmth your body could steal from the environment before the frost stole it from you. That's how medieval peasants lived, on a rhythm not of efficiency, but of survival. Because in a world without thermostats or hot water bottles, time itself became a thermal strategy. And to stay alive, they didn't just endure the cold, they organized around it. The day didn't start at sunrise. It started at first light, but only for those assigned to keep the fire alive. Villages designated roles like frost watchers or ember keepers, rotating duties to ensure at least one person was responsible for the central hearth's coals. Overnight, if you woke to a dead fire, that wasn't an inconvenience, that was an emergency. Starting a new fire from scratch without matches, lighters, or dry kindling could take hours, and hours without heat could mean frostbite, illness, or death. So villages developed systems, duty rotations, signal taps, even fines for negligence. A late ember was a broken promise dot between roughly 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. When the sun reached its highest arc, the real work began. Those 4 hours were the thermal sweet spot, the time when the air was just warm enough to move freely without risking exposure. That's when people did the hardest tasks: hauling water, mending roofs, chopping wood, baking bread, rendering fat, digging trenches. And because daylight was limited and energy needed conservation, villagers moved as a unit. Communal tasks were tackled with synchronized effort, often signaled by the toll of a single bell or the smell of a shared pot bubbling in the central oven. Evenings weren't just downtime, they were strategy. At twilight, councils weren't just political gatherings, they were thermal events. Whole families and sometimes entire communities gathered in one room to share warmth through proximity. Sitting shoulder to shoulder, they pulled body heat the way we now pull data. The warmth wasn't just comforting, it was measurable. A room with 15 people was 10 to 15 degrees warmer than the same room with just a single fire and 2 bodies. Huddling wasn't laziness, it was thermal math. Nighttime introduced its own rhythm, one that today would seem strange, but once was perfectly natural. Split sleep, people went to bed shortly after sundown, then awoke in the dead of night for a few hours before drifting off again until morning. That middle window between first sleep and second sleep became a secret hour of productivity and reflection. Letters were written, firewood was rearranged, conversations whispered, prayers offered, and, yes, body heat redistributed. Families used these waking moments to rotate positions, shift the blankets, or reheat stones. It was comfort by choreography. But perhaps the most overlooked thermal innovation was the use of communal ovens. These weren't just about baking, they were about heat retention. In many villages, ovens were built into shared buildings, with scheduled time slots for each household. Once the bread was baked, the residual heat could linger for hours. Some families would sleep against the warm outer wall of the baking house, or bring small loaves home wrapped in cloth to act as personal heat packs. Nothing was wasted, not warmth, not steam, not timing. Time wasn't counted in minutes, it was counted in degrees. Villagers didn't ask, "How long will this take?" They asked, "Will it be warm enough to finish this?" Or, "Can we do it together to get it done faster?" It wasn't just survival, it was synchronization. Every gesture was a negotiation between effort and energy loss. And here's the irony: we often think of them as primitive, but in many ways, their relationship with time was more advanced than ours. They understood what most of us have forgotten, that clocks can't keep you warm, but rhythm can keep you alive. 3. The dirt beneath their feet. How food was preserved without ice. There were no refrigerators humming in the background, no freezers packed with backup meals, no plastic wrap, Tupperware, or expiration dates, and yet somehow medieval. Peasants not only kept food from spoiling, they kept entire families alive. For months through deep winter, using nothing but soil, straw, instinct, and time-tested ingenuity. This wasn't primitive food storage. It was a system, ancient, tactile, astonishingly effective. And it all started just beneath their feet. If you wanted to eat in March, you had to plan in August. And if you didn't have ice, you had to think like the earth. That meant root cellars, yes, but more often, it meant underground storage pits. Simple. Shallow holes dug in the coldest parts of the garden, or forest edge lined with hay, clay, or woven branches. In these pits, food was not stored, it was nested. Turnips, parsnips, onions, and apples were packed in layers of straw and soil. Each layer breathing, each material absorbing just enough moisture to keep the air humid but not moldy. These were not fridges. They were living ecosystems calibrated by feel, scent, and seasonal memory. A single well-insulated pit could preserve root vegetables for 3 to 5 months, sometimes longer. Some pits were fitted with makeshift ventilation. Long reeds or hollow sticks poked through the surface to regulate airflow. Temperature regulation wasn't measured with thermometers, but with intuition and touch. If the soil near the top felt too warm, straw was added. If mold appeared, the whole pit was rotated. Spoilage wasn't feared. It was read as a message, a warning, a prompt to shift the food inward, deeper into safety, even preservation zones. Within the pit were understood. The top layer might hold faster-use items, apples, softer roots. The bottom layer, colder and more stable, was for hardy vegetables like cabbage or long-keeping turnips. Think of it as medieval cold chain logistics, only run entirely by hand, smell, and muscle. But winter preservation wasn't just underground. It was in fermentation, a method medieval peasants didn't just understand, but relied on: sauerkraut, pickled roots, fermented grains, preserved dairy, all created through wild bacteria that added flavor, longevity, and gut health to an otherwise stale diet. And perhaps most beautiful of all, these foods didn't just survive, they got better over time. A turnip left in the pit for 3 months was softer, sweeter, more digestible. A cheese aged in a cool corner became sharper, richer, more prized. Then there was drying. In autumn, herbs were strung in kitchens, root vegetables sliced and laid on woven mats, apples and pears cored and suspended from rafters. Some families smoked meats over low fires. Others soaked beans in ash brine or wrapped grain in linen soaked in vinegar. In every case, the goal wasn't to preserve flavor, it was to preserve survival. Taste was a bonus. And yet, despite the low-tech methods, what they achieved would rival modern artisanal pantries. And yes, sometimes it failed. Sometimes the frost crept too deep or the hay rotted early. But that's where redundancy came in. Food wasn't stored in one place. It was distributed a little under the floorboards, a little in the family's garden pit, some in the communal cellar, some in the walls of the livestock barn. If rats found one, if mold took another, the rest remained. Medieval food storage wasn't built on convenience. It was built on resilience. Today, we throw away a third of our food. Back then, waste meant death. So every apple was turned. Every cabbage was checked. Every pit was remembered by its smell, its temperature, its personality. This was food preservation as a kind of conversation between people and the earth. And it worked, not because they had the best tools, but because they listened the closest. For spoonfuls of heat, the food that fought the cold from the inside out, if your walls were thin, your fire small, and the night long, there was only one place left to create warmth, inside your own body. And medieval peasants knew this truth intimately. They couldn't rely on modern central heating or calorie calculators, but they understood with absolute clarity that what you ate could mean the difference between freezing and surviving. So every bite was more than nourishment. It was armor, fuel, a slow-burning fire that started in your gut and spread outward to your fingertips. The cornerstone of this internal heat strategy was a single dish, pottage. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't have a recipe, but it was everywhere and everything a thick, layered stew that lived in a pot over the hearth day and night, constantly replenished, constantly evolving. You'd start with whatever grain was on hand: barley, oats, or rice dough in root vegetables like parsnip, turnip, or carrot. Toss in onions or leeks for flavor. Then add greens or beans when available. Meat, if you had it, was a luxury. A bone or fat scrap was more likely. Salt, herbs, or vinegar extended the flavor. And time turned it into magic. It was a dish designed not to impress, but to sustain. And every ingredient had a thermal purpose. Barley and oats were slow to digest, giving lasting warmth. Root vegetables were dense with carbohydrates. Leeks and onions, mildly antimicrobial, doubled as medicine. And fats rendered from animals, saved from cooking, sometimes even harvested from marrow, were prized for their ability to stretch both flavor and calories. One bowl of pottage could contain over 800 calories, no small feat in a world where the average peasant needed between 4,000 and 5,000 calories a day just to stay warm in winter. That's not gluttony. That's biology. When you're exposed to constant cold, your body burns fuel like a forge, converting stored energy into heat, every cell working overtime to maintain its fragile internal balance. So food wasn't just eaten, it was layered like clothing into the body. And then there were the seasonings, not just for taste but for effect. Medieval cooks added garlic and horseradish to stimulate circulation. They used warming herbs like sage, thyme, and mustard seed to push heat into the limbs. Vinegars helped preserve, yes, but also acted as digestive balancers. Honey and ale added sugar when it could be spared. Spices, if available from trade, black pepper, cinnamon, clove, were used sparingly, not just for flavor, but as medicine, currency, and warmth boosters. A single pinch of spice in a communal pot could turn a meal into a ritual. But perhaps the most underappreciated weapon in their dietary arsenal was fermentation. Every village had its crocks of fermented cabbage, sour rye porridge, beer, vinegar, pickles, and cheese, not just for preservation, but because these foods supported gut health in ways that directly affected immune strength and metabolism. Modern science confirms what medieval instinct already knew: a healthy gut keeps you warmer longer. Even when they ate mattered. Heaviest meals came at dawn and midday when bodies were active and the heat generated could be retained through movement. Evenings were lighter, allowing the body to cool before sleep. That rhythm conserved energy, optimized warmth, and matched the light-dark cycle in ways we now pay thousands to replicate with biohacking, gadgets, and when food was scarce, They adapted. Acorn flour was soaked to remove toxins and added to porridge. Nettles were picked for soup. Chickweed, sorrel, fat hen or foraged greens were tossed into the pot. Food was elastic. It changed with the seasons. But the goal never did. Keep the fire alive from within. They didn't talk about metabolism. They didn't count carbs. But they ate with precision honed by generations of cold. They weren't just feeding hunger. They were feeding heat. 5 stacked like firewood, sleeping arrangements that battled the freeze. By the time the last embers dimmed and the night crept fully in, the cold wasn't just a discomfort, it was an adversary. And there, in the thick black silence of medieval winter, one question mattered most. How do you sleep without freezing? The answer wasn't luxury or softness, it was strategy. Because for medieval peasants, sleep wasn't about dreams, it was about not dying, and they approached it with the same tactical precision as any fortress defense. The bed wasn't a bed. It was a platform sloped, angled, often made of packed earth, stone, or wood. It tilted upward toward the fire, usually at a 15-degree angle, allowing heat to drift naturally toward the head and core. And instead of one bed per person, it was one bed for everyone. Families slept stacked, packed as tightly as firewood in a hearth. Children nestled between parents, elders tucked behind them. Infants swaddled and placed at the center like coals. It wasn't just affection, it was thermal engineering. The closer you were to another living body, the longer you retained your warmth. One person sleeping alone might lose heat by midnight. 5 sleeping together could make it to morning dot above them. Blankets weren't layered, they were weighted. Furs, wool, thick linen stuffed with straw or moss. Sometimes cloaks doubled as covers. The outermost layer was often something unconventional. A hide, a treated sack, or even a stiffened piece of cloth oiled with fat for water resistance. And beneath them, elevation. Beds were always at least a foot off the floor, sometimes on crates, sometimes on stone slabs, sometimes over composting animal bedding. Why? Because cold air sinks. The floor was the coldest part of the room. Sleep. Too close to it, and you wouldn't wake up, and it didn't stop there. Some homes had sleep inspectors, older family members or village elders who woke during the night to check on others, rotate positions, feed the fire, and make sure infants weren't suffocating or freezing. Their job wasn't mystical. It was thermal logistics. The survival of the group depended on this periodic redistributions of heat. This choreography of sleep that rotated people from the edges toward the center, like logs being turned in a fire. And then there was the animal factor. In poorer households, animals slept inside not for protection, but for heat. Chickens in corners, goats near the door, and pigs, yes, pigs often slept directly under or beside the family bed. Their breath, their bodies, their sheer metabolic energy raised room temperatures significantly. In some cases, people even built their beds over livestock pens, separated by slatted floors so that the rising warmth of cows or goats could permeate the space above. Think of it as the first radiant heat system powered by hooves and hay. Privacy, it didn't exist. Shame, no time for it. Cold didn't care about modesty, and when the snow blew in through the shutters and the frost settled over your boots, the only thing that mattered was not being alone. Even clothing at night was optimized. Peasants didn't undress to sleep. They added layers, a tunic, another cloak, a cap. They slept in sleeping hats, long and drooping to cover ears and neck, socks stuffed with straw, mittens tied with twine. Some even kept heated stones at their feet, wrapped in cloth and reheated every few hours by those on fire duty. The goal was constant. Maintain core warmth, protect extremities, and wake up breathing, and so night became a shared event, a team effort. Survival through synchrony. They didn't wait for spring to save them. They saved each other one tightly packed night at a time. 6. Woven warmth, the medieval art of dressing against the cold. If your house was half buried, your fire barely more than embers, and your sleep filled with the breath of livestock, then your last line of defense against the medieval cold wasn't your roof, it was your clothing. But not just any clothing, not fashionable layers or flashy colors. What you wore was armor, not against swords or arrows, but against temperature, damp, and death. And just like everything else medieval peasants mastered, their approach to winter dress wasn't random. It was layered, local, and deeply intelligent. Start with the foundation, wool, the miracle fiber of the Middle Ages. It kept you warm even when wet. It trapped body heat without suffocating skin, and it was durable enough to last through brutal labor. But peasants didn't just wear wool, they engineered it. Each layer served a purpose. The innermost might be a coarse tunic, sometimes softened, with a lining of linen or worn raw to thicken skin through contact. Over that came thicker woolen overcoats, wraps, and cloaks. But unlike modern fashion, more wasn't always better. What mattered was how the layers interacted: air pockets, wind resistance, moisture control. They were dressing for survival, not for style. Now here's the part we rarely hear. They didn't wash their wool in winter. Why? Because washing will strip away its natural lanolin, the oily coating that made it water-resistant and wind-repellent. By keeping the lanolin intact, they preserved warmth, reduced moisture penetration, and extended the garment's life. That scratchy, slightly greasy coat, it was better than Gore-Tex. They wore their wool until spring, then scoured, rinsed, and aired it when the sun returned. And that system worked, not because it was pleasant, but because it was proven. But wool alone wasn't enough. They added insulation in the clothing itself. Moss, straw, even down feathers were stuffed into slits between two layers of linen or wool to create homemade padding. Stitching held the fill in place. Some winter garments were quilted, not for decoration, but to create micro-traps of air, retaining heat more efficiently. A thick tunic with stitched layers of hay might weigh 15 pounds, but it could keep you alive. During an open field crossing at dusk, then came the accessories. Cloaks were life-saving tools. A well-made cloak was thick, hooded, and heavy enough to wrap around the entire body like a cocoon. In rain or snow, it shed moisture and shielded the inner layers. Hoods were long and pointed, designed to cover the back of the neck where warmth escapes fastest. Hats were non-negotiable. Wool caps, fur-wrapped bands, linen tied around ears, head covering wasn't optional. It was thermal triage. Lose your head heat, lose your chance at sleep, and don't underestimate the herb chest. Clothing wasn't just worn, it was stored strategically. When not in use, winter garments were packed in wooden chests filled with lavender, thyme, rosemary, or mugwort. Why? These herbs weren't just fragrant, they were antimicrobial, antifungal, and insect repellent. In an age before mothballs or detergents, this was critical. And the scent, it lingered through the season, offering a small comfort, proof that warmth could smell like something, too. Modern winter gear is synthetic, mass-produced, interchangeable. But medieval peasants wore knowledge. Every seam, every stitch, every smell told a story. They didn't have climate-controlled closets or puffy parkas. They had sheep, hands, time-bound wisdom passed down across frozen generations. And maybe most impressive of all, their clothes weren't disposable. They were patched, traded, reshaped. An old cloak became a new vest. A torn tunic became lining for boots. And boots, those were often layers of wool and moss, tied with leather straps and waterproofed with animal fat or pine resin, smeared into seams and left to dry in the smoke. One good pair could last a lifetime. If your feet stayed dry, you stayed alive. They didn't dress for appearance, they dressed for outcome. Their style wasn't minimal. It was maximal function in a world that did not forgive mistakes. 7. Livestock and heat. The animals that warmed the home. It's easy to romanticize the pastoral life: chickens clucking in the yard, goats grazing under golden light, a cow lowing in the distance. But in the bitter teeth of winter, livestock were not idyllic background noise. They were the difference between life and death. And medieval peasants didn't just raise animals for food. They invited them inside, because in a world without central heating, animals weren't just livestock. They were heaters that breathed. A medieval peasant's home was often one room, shared with the entire family, and when winter came, their animals. It wasn't gross, it was logical. Animals gave off body heat, just like humans, but with larger mass and higher metabolic output. A few cows, goats, or pigs could increase the indoor temperature of a small cottage by up to 10 Celsius 18F. That wasn't convenience. That was thermodynamic gold. The layout was intentional. Animals didn't just wander inside. They had designated areas, low pens dug into the floor, divided by wooden rails, sometimes even built partially below the living space to maximize rising heat. Families slept above these pens, often on elevated wooden platforms or beds raised on crates, creating a crude but effective radiant heating system, powered entirely by biology and architecture. And unlike a wood fire, livestock provided continuous, stable warmth even through the night. But the strategy didn't stop at warmth. The animals' waste, yes, their manure and urine wasn't a nuisance. It was a resource. Straw or hay laid beneath them absorbed waste, and over time, this composted layer generated heat through microbial activity. Think of it as an early biothermal floor. The bedding was layered weekly, sometimes daily, creating thick, warm piles that radiated heat upward. At the end of winter, that waste bedding would be moved outside to fertilize fields, a thermal cycle that turned excrement into spring grain. Which animals? Cows were the MVPs. A single adult cow could warm an entire side of a room and provide milk through the winter. Pigs came next, not just for warmth, but because they were small heat factories, grunting and snorting and curling up near humans. Chickens were brought inside in baskets or small coops to keep egg production going. Even dogs had a role, not as pets, but as foot warmers trained to sleep near the family bed. Every animal had a purpose. Every purpose was thermal dot, and then came the rotation systems. Larger households developed livestock shifts, where different animals were brought inside depending on space. And warmth needs, in some villages, are central. Barn acted as a shared heat hub. People slept beside their animals not because it was quaint, but because their lives depended on it. The smells? Strong, but tolerable. Floors were layered with straw, ash, or herbs like sweet woodruff or mugwort to neutralize odors. Windows were cracked open during the day for airflow, brief, strategic bursts of cold air to reset the interior climate. And anyone who complained knew the truth: better stink than frostbite. Modern homes are designed to isolate us from nature. Medieval homes did the opposite. They integrated it. They invited nature in, learned from it, leaned on it. The animals didn't just feed the family, they kept it alive in the coldest hours. When the fire burned low and the walls leaked too much wind, they were companions. Yes, but more than that, they were infrastructure. And as strange as it may seem, the science backs them up. In times of extreme energy loss, blackouts, disasters rescue agencies still recommend huddling with pets for warmth. Medieval peasants didn't need the data. They had instinct and centuries of tradition whispering the same truth. Warmth doesn't just come from flame. Sometimes it comes from breath. 8. Shared heat. How community warmed the coldest corners. No one in a medieval village survived winter alone. You could have the warmest cloak, the strongest hearth, the fattest pig, but if your neighbor was freezing, you were at risk. 2. Because warmth wasn't just a personal resource, it was a communal economy passed hand to hand, body to body, obligation to obligation. The people who survived winter best weren't always the wealthiest. They were the ones who understood this principle: warmth grows when it's shared. At the heart of this system were community buildings, and none were more important than the bakehouse. Not just a place for bread, but a thermal anchor. These massive ovens, often centrally located in the village, burned hot for hours, first for baking, then for surviving. After bread was pulled from the fire, families would take turns sitting near the cooling stones, absorbing the residual heat. Elderly villagers might be granted early access. Mothers with infants' necks, everyone had a turn. The oven was a thermal redistribution device as important as the bread it produced. But the most fascinating communal tool was the warmth rotation system. Villagers took turns tending the fires, baking, carrying wood, and even hosting others in their homes on rotation. During extreme cold spells, a family with a particularly well-insulated home might house several others for a night or two, creating what was essentially a temporary thermal co-op. No one questioned it. It was part of the survival contract. You might be the one in need next week. Then there were the gathering halls, simple structures, sometimes part of a church, monastery, or common house. Designed with thick walls, few windows, and stone floors, they had double-door systems, small vestibules, to prevent gusts of cold from entering directly. Inside, people met at sundown to share warmth, stories, meals, and sometimes even coordinated work like mending clothes or drying herbs. These weren't parties. They were survival collectives. Even weddings and festivals were timed with the thermal calendar. Winter marriages often took place just after the deepest freeze, not for romance, but because they brought people together to generate communal heat, feast on preserved food, and celebrate in the warmest space available. A dancing crowd in a small hall with closed shutters, better than a bonfire. Children were trained early. Part of their chores included fuel-gathering walks, often done in groups for safety and efficiency. Boys and girls would comb the surrounding woods for branches, dried animal dung, pinnacones, even bark and brambles, anything that burned. These weren't idle strolls. They were daily acts of keeping the village alive. And if one child was too sick or too cold to go, others carried double. Even songs and games were optimized. Circle dances kept feet moving. Chant games had rhythmic stomping and clapping to build heat. In the darkest weeks, villages organized group rituals not because they were bored, but because motion created warmth. The more they moved together, the longer the fire could rest. And behind all of this was an invisible structure of social enforcement. A villager who hoarded wood or refused to take their warmth duties seriously could face fines, public shame, or even banishment, not out of cruelty, but because selfishness in winter could kill the village. Cold was not a private matter. It was a shared burden, and every breath exhaled into the air of a communal space was part of the plan. This is the piece we often forget today, that survival isn't a solo act, it's a chorus. And in the Middle Ages, that chorus sang, cooked and shivered together, making sure that no one was left out in the frost, because when warmth is shared, it doesn't divide, it multiplies. 9. Cold logic, how everything was designed to beat the freeze. The Middle Ages weren't built on coincidence, they were built on necessity. And nowhere is that more apparent than in the cold. If you looked closely at any medieval village, you'd see 1,000 tiny decisions, design choices, spatial arrangements, materials used not dictated by fashion or convenience, but by one simple truth: everything must fight the cold. And so it did. Let's start with village layout. Homes didn't sprawl across the land. They were clustered tightly, often facing inward, forming courtyards that trapped sunlight and body heat while shielding against wind. The narrow alleys between houses weren't poor planning. They were thermal corridors. In summer, they created shade, but in winter they reduced exposure, blocked icy gales, and allowed people to pass warmth, both literal and social, on their way through. Houses often faced east or south, maximizing exposure to the sun's low winter arc. Roofs were steeply pitched, not just to shed snow, but to prevent accumulation. That could collapse structures and to keep upper levels insulated with air pockets. That's right, even the attic space in a peasant's home, crude though it was, served as a thermal buffer, trapping hot air rising from the hearth below. Doors were low, not because people were shorter, but because less space meant less heat, escaped every time someone came or went. Windows were tiny and often covered with oiled cloth or animal horn, letting in light but not wind. The openings were strategic compromises, just enough to see, never enough to let winter inside. Even flooring had logic. Many homes used packed earth, layered with straw, ash, or reeds. Not the most comfortable surface, but a smart one. Ash absorbed moisture and kept pests down. Straw insulated, and the layering created a kind of primitive heat sink, especially if animals were housed below. In some regions, floors were even intentionally sloped, allowing melted snow and urine to run off efficiently, minimizing damp that would sap warmth. Materials were chosen not for beauty, but for performance. Wattle and daub walls weren't just cheap, they were thermally resilient, holding heat in winter and resisting the sun in summer. Roofs were insulated with thatch so thick it muffled wind entirely. In alpine regions, moss was stuffed between logs. In coastal areas, seaweed lined outer walls. The regional adaptation to climate was instinctive and precise. Inside, the logic continued. Ceilings were low to keep heat near the ground. Storage shelves were built high, near the warmer ceiling space, while sleeping areas were slightly raised. Off the floor to avoid cold sinks, hearths were central not just for access, but to distribute heat evenly. In some homes, the hearth was sunken, creating a thermal depression that warmed feet, first critical in frostbite prevention, even every day. Items had dual purposes. Bread ovens doubled as heaters. Stone benches built into walls retained heat after days of baking. Linen curtains separated spaces, trapping warm air in sleeping areas. Chests placed against walls served as both furniture and insulation. And tools were stored near the hearth not just for convenience, but so they wouldn't crack or warp from cold. Villages themselves were designed to adapt over time. Some buildings were seasonally converted. Barns became temporary dormitories during deep winter. Lean-tos were attached to homes to break wind and provide extra insulation. Snow was not always cleared. In fact, in some cases, it was piled around outer walls as an extra insulator. Yes, they built snow berms before anyone named them that. This wasn't architecture. It was thermal intelligence, passed down by generations who had no time for theory, only outcome. And that outcome had to be the same year after year. Stay alive until the thaw. There's a quiet beauty to that kind of design. It wasn't showy. It wasn't aspirational. But it was honest. It said, this is what we have. Let's use it to fight back against the dark. 10. The fire in the gut, fermentation, fat, and fighting the freeze from within. You can wrap yourself in wool. You can bury yourself under fur. You can share a bed with animals and sleep above composting straw. But at the end of the coldest day, warmth must still come from the inside, from your blood, your belly, the slow, sustained burn of calories and microbes that work long after the fire dies down. And in the Middle Ages, peasants knew this not in scientific terms, but in survival terms. They didn't just eat to fill the stomach, they ate to ignite the gut. To stoke a fire no wind could blow out, they achieved this through to ancient weapons of winter, fermentation and fat. Let's start with fermentation. Medieval peasants fermented everything they could. Cabbage became sauerkraut. Rye turned into sour porridge. Milk was soured into clabber or soft cheese. Beer was weak but constant, bubbling in barrels. Even root vegetables like turnips were brined and buried. These foods didn't just last longer, they got better over time. They transformed from perishables into living, breathing ecosystems, filled with bacteria that supported digestion, immunity, and internal heat generation. Modern science now tells us what they already sensed. Fermented foods fuel the gut microbiome, which regulates everything from metabolism to inflammation. A strong microbiome helps your body absorb more energy from food and burn it efficiently. In cold climates, this was nothing short of vital. You couldn't afford to lose calories through waste or inefficiency. Your system had to extract every bit of warmth from every scrap of food. And fermentation didn't require wealth. It required time, air, and touch. A crock, a cloth, a corner near the fire. Fermentation was passed down not through cookbooks but through habit. A grandmother's hand, a father's whisper, a neighbor's borrowed starter. It was culinary inheritance and winter survival. Bottled. Then came fat. In the modern world, fat is feared. In the medieval world, fat was sacred. It was the battery that powered your body through long nights and short days. It was smeared on bread, stirred into soup, rendered from every usable animal scrap. Pork fat, duck fat, marrow, suit, whatever could be extracted, saved, stored, or scraped. Fat meant calories. Calories meant heat. And heat meant one more morning. Even the poor found ways to get it. Bone broth wasn't about flavor, it was about pulling every molecule of energy from what little you had. A single greasy film on the surface of your pottage was a victory, a sign that the storm might carry you through the next freeze. And here's the brilliance. Peasants understood how to balance fermentation and fat. Fermented grains like sourdough were often eaten with fatty spreads or broths. Pickled vegetables were paired with rich stews. Sour beer washed down dense oat cakes. The acidity helped the body process fat. The fat extended the calories of meager meals. The two systems weren't just parallel, they were symbiotic. The calendar helped too. Early winter meals were heavier, fat-laden, fueled by autumn slaughter. Midwinter meals leaned on preserved vegetables and fermented stock. By late winter, as fatigue set in and supplies dwindled, fermented foods carried a second role: mental clarity. Some peasants even brewed mild fermented tonics with honey and herbs, designed not to intoxicate, but to revive. The gut was the furnace, and what you fed it mattered. This wasn't about indulgence, it was about engineering. A diet crafted not for pleasure, but for performance, for internal combustion, meal after meal, night after night. Because when you're cold, what you eat isn't just fuel, it's fire. 11. Night watch. How villagers guarded the heat hour by hour. The sun dips below the horizon, and with it goes the last free warmth of the day. In the medieval world, nighttime was not rest, it was a siege. Every hour past dusk was a battle against the creeping cold, a stretch of darkness that threatened to undo all the work done in daylight. And so the village prepared, not by sleeping deeply and forgetting the danger, but by assigning vigilance. Because warmth could not be trusted to stay on its own. It had to be guarded. The hearth was the heart of this battle. It burned all day, but come nightfall, it became something more fragile. The fire had to be managed like a newborn. Too little fuel and it would die. Too much and it would waste precious wood, or worse, set the thatch alight. That's where the night watch came in. Most villages, this duty rotated. Each family or member took turns hourly, nightly, seasonally to tend the communal or household fire. This wasn't a matter of convenience. It was law. Some communities even had warmth codes, punishable by fine or sanction if your neglect endangered others. You weren't just tending your fire, you were protecting the sleeping bodies that depended on it. Breath. These watchers didn't just throw on logs. They used strategy. Hardwoods for long burns, softwoods for fast heat, bark for smoke. Embers banked under ash to preserve coals until morning. It was silent alchemy done in shadow. They moved with wool-wrapped feet to avoid stirring air, rotated. Sleepers gently when drafts hit the wall, and if need be, placed heated stones near frostbitten limbs. Some watchers doubled as midnight inspectors, quietly opening bedroom curtains, checking on infants, ensuring the outer door was latched tight. Others kept a timed cycle, using water clocks or burning rope knotted at intervals to track their shift. Still others trusted instinct. Wake up when it feels too cold. Move like breath through the room. Return to stillness once the glow returns. It was an hour of solitude, of burden, but also of profound purpose. These watchers weren't servants, they were guardians. Their role was seen as an honor often entrusted to the strong, the wise, the quietly reliable. In monastic life, it became sacred part of the canonical hours of prayer. In family homes, it was passed down. The mother watches tonight, the eldest son tomorrow. No one skipped. Everyone took part, and the watchers weren't alone. The architecture worked with them. Homes were built to retain ember heat if sealed properly. Curtains were drawn, floor cracks plugged, animal pens inspected. Even the bedding was positioned to catch any radiant warmth. In villages with communal fires, the watch moved outdoors, tending a central blaze under the stars, sheltering it with windbreaks, feeding it scraps of dry bramble collected during the day. These watchfires didn't just preserve warmth. They sent a signal: someone is awake, someone is protecting the light, and if the watcher failed, the results were immediate. Cold seeped in, breath grew sharp, limbs went numb, infants wailed. A single lost fire could spell disaster, and so redundancy was built in. Secondary embers were stored in clay pots, wrapped in wool, buried under hay. If the main fire died, these sleeping coals could be revived. Not easily, but it was possible. And that possibility was everything. Today, we press a button, roll over, and trust the heater to do its job. But back then, heat came with a heartbeat. You had to watch it, feed it, respect it, and in that sacred nighttime rhythm, waking, tending, resting villagers didn't just survive winter. They partnered with it. 12. The resilience diet, how villagers adjusted their calories, cravings, and clock to survive winter. In the modern world, diets come from trend reports, fitness influencers, and food pyramids designed in boardrooms. In the medieval world, the diet came from the earth, the fire, and the cold. And the peasant didn't eat for abs or aesthetics. They ate for one reason only: to survive the night. Their meals weren't glamorous, but they were adaptable, precise, and forged through the wisdom of generations who had learned how to manipulate the body's rhythms. As carefully as they stacked firewood, winter required more food, but not just more. It required different food, denser, slower burning. The medieval peasant instinctively followed what we'd now call a metabolic calendar. As the days shortened, their meals thickened. Their caloric intake increased, often to double or even triple what they ate during spring, and they weren't overeating. They were fueling a furnace. Think about it. When the outside temperature plummets, your body burns energy not just to move, but to stay warm, doing nothing at all. Sitting by a fire still costs you calories. Sleeping in a cold bed still drains. your fuel. So peasants adjusted. They didn't count calories, they felt them. If you woke up with numb fingers, you ate more fat at breakfast. If you had to walk a mile to fetch water in snow, you added barley to the evening pottage. It was eating not by rule, but by weather, labor, and sensation. They also changed the timing of meals. Mornings were heavy soups thickened with grain, pieces of cheese or animal fat if it was a good day. Midday was the true feast, leftovers stewed again, sometimes fresh bread. A communal dish if a pig had recently been slaughtered. Evening was modest, designed to stoke the final bit of warmth but not overwork the stomach during the long, cold sleep. This rhythm wasn't just tradition, it was physiology. Heavy food in the morning kick-started thermogenesis. Lighter meals at night allowed the body to burn slow during rest. And cravings, they weren't indulgence. They were signals. Craving salt. Your sweat loss was to hide from heavy labor under too many clothes. Craving something sour. Your gut wanted fermented food. Craving something fatty. Your body was begging for insulation. The villagers didn't shame these cravings, they listened to them, honored them, met them where they rose. They even understood fasting in the winter, though not in the way we do now. Religious calendars dictated fasting periods, but smart. Peasants found ways to bend the rules without breaking the body. Almond milk, ground grain gruels, dried peas boiled into paste, all technically fast appropriate, but nutritionally vital. It wasn't cheating. It was survival through faith and food literacy. And then there was variety through monotony. The meals didn't change often, but the way they were assembled, flavored, fermented, layered that created texture and surprise. One pot of root pottage might evolve over 5 days, growing sour, gaining richness, borrowing scraps from last night's bread or the neighbor's beanstalk. Meals were built like relationships, slowly, day by day, shaped by what was available and who was hungry. Children were trained to recognize the cues. They knew how long a cabbage would last before spoiling. They could spot frost damage on an onion or tell when cheese was too sour to eat. But perfect to melt, eating wasn't passive. It was participatory. And that knowledge passed down from mother to daughter, grandfather to grandson was the real nutrition. Because calories meant nothing without context and timing. In the end, their diet wasn't paleo, keto, plant-based or engineered. It was resilient, built for the body in motion, the gut in need, and the soul in winter. 13. The frozen clock, how time, light, and darkness shaped winter survival. In a world where clocks didn't tick and electricity hadn't been born, time wasn't read on dials, it was felt in the bones. It was mapped in shadows, in the creak of frozen wood, in the silence that stretched longer with each setting sun. In medieval winter, time itself froze, and yet somehow peasants shaped their days with clarity and rhythm, not through numbers, but through adaptation. They knew that to survive the cold, you didn't fight the darkness. You danced with it. At its coldest, winter brought not just freezing winds and short days, but psychological collapse, depression, fatigue, fear. So the villagers built structure into the void. When the sun rose late and set early, they reorganized the day. Work hours shifted, social rhythms bent. Chores were concentrated in tight, bright windows, and rest became a revolving necessity. Sunrise no longer marked the beginning of labor, it marked the moment you checked if the fire still lived. True work began only once warmth had returned to your hands. That might be 10 a.m., it might be noon. Time flexed because life demanded it, and the peasants didn't resist the pull of darkness. They used it. In the deepest months, December, January, they leaned into a rhythm that today seems radical but was once normal: segmented sleep. First sleep began after dusk, often around 7 p.m. Then, after a few hours of rest, they would wake naturally, not with alarm, but with instinct sometime around midnight. This in-between time, called the watch, was sacred. During this twilight intermission, families rekindled the hearth, whispered prayers, mended clothes, even visited neighbors. Some used it to pray, others to reflect, journal, or teach children. Quietly, there was no rush, no pressure to sleep right, just the awareness that time was cyclical, not linear. After a couple hours, they'd return to bed for second sleep, which lasted until the rooster crowed or the frost pressed too hard to ignore. This way of sleeping aligned with circadian biology and provided moments of warmth management, physical adjustment, and communal reflection. It wasn't an inconvenience. It was a survival mechanism disguised as a rhythm, and yet, even without clocks, they kept time. Sundials gave way to water clocks indoors, with dripping mechanisms that marked the night watch's duty more often. It was fire that kept time measured by how long a specific log burned or how far a candle melted. If your shift began at the half burn, you didn't need a number. You needed eyes, awareness. Intuition. Church bells were the village's collective heartbeat. Canonical hours, matins, lauds, prime, terce, and so on structured the day, especially in monastic communities. But even secular peasants borrowed that structure. When light became scarce, sound became sacred. A bell at dusk told you when to bring the animals in. A bell at dawn reminded you to check the outer firewood pile. It wasn't piety, it was precision. The lengthening and shortening of shadows became as dependable as any sundial. A mother knew how long her stew had simmered by how the light stretched across the floor. A boy timed goat milking by how quickly frost returned to the windowsill. No two days were the same, but the patterns were familiar, repeated, trusted. And when even those signals failed, when storms hit the sun, when bells froze, when the night lasted too long, they turned to the oldest guide of all, storytelling. Oral tradition filled the void of mechanical time. Stir the pot until the second wolf tale ends. Go fetch more straw when the fire cracks the third time. It sounds whimsical, but in practice, it was clockwork in disguise. They didn't need precision, they needed stability. And in their frozen world, that stability came from within, from listening, from feeling time as temperature, as sound, as breath. In winter, time slowed. But it didn't stop. The peasant didn't panic. They adjusted, and in doing so, they carved hours not from quartz or copper, but from observation and grace. 14. When the freeze winds, illness, death, and the fragility beneath the wall. For all the cleverness, the layering, the fire tending, and fermented calories. Sometimes it wasn't enough. Sometimes the wind was too cruel, the frost too deep, the food too thin. Sometimes a child's breath slowed in the night, or a cough in the elder's chest turned from gravel to silence. The truth is, for medieval peasants, winter wasn't just hard, it was merciless. And despite all their strategies, they knew it deep down. Beneath the wool and ash and brave faces, every family harbored the same fear. This might be the year. The cold winds. Because illness in winter didn't ask permission. It arrived quietly in the lungs, in the gut, in the bones, and it spread like smoke. A simple chill could become a fever. A blister could blacken into gangrene. A cough, untreated, could ripple through a household. There were no antibiotics, no hospitals. Medicine came from herbs, hot broth, compresses, and faith. Respiratory illness was the great predator. Cold, damp air seeped into homes, weakened immune defenses, and made every breath an invitation for sickness. Pneumonia, bronchitis, pleurisy, words they may not have known, but symptoms they understood intimately. A wheezing chest, blood in a cloth, the rattle of breath before dawn. And once it began, the entire household adjusted. Sleeping arrangements changed. Firewood was prioritized. Food was thickened. Priests were sent for, and everyone waited. Then there was hypothermia, a silent killer not even recognized as such. A child who wandered outside too long, a worker who fell asleep beside the barn, an elder too proud to ask for an extra blanket, shivering, then confusion, then stillness. In a world without thermometers or emergency rooms, they learned to read the danger in slurred speech, pale lips, unresponsive hands, and they responded the only way they could, with body heat, strong broth, prayer, and hope. Malnutrition made everything worse. By February, supplies were thin. The preserved cabbage was limp. The root cellar was nearly bare. The bread was crust and bone. And a body without fuel cannot stay warm, cannot fight infection, cannot rise in the morning. Children suffered, first losing weight, becoming listless, then the elderly. And in those final weeks before spring cracked the soil, some villagers simply faded. But perhaps the most brutal blow came not from cold or hunger, but from despair. Seasonal depression, what we now recognize as a chemical and emotional reaction to prolonged darkness and isolation, was rampant. Called melancholia, or winter sadness, it showed in silence, in prayer that never lifted, in the way someone stopped singing. A man would stop chopping wood, a mother would forget to eat, a child would sit by the door for hours, waiting for something they couldn't name. They didn't have therapy, but they had rituals, candle lighting, hymns, solstice celebrations, small superstitions, charms hung by the door, herbal teas brewed not just for the body, but for the soul. They fought despair as they fought frost with what they had, with touch, with community, with old stories that reminded them the sun returns. And when death did command it, often did, it wasn't hidden. It was wrapped in linen, laid on a board, surrounded by family. Children watched, neighbors visited, the body stayed in the room, near the hearth, until the earth softened enough to bury it. There was no morgue, no cremation, just farewell beside the warmth that could not save them this time. There was grief, yes, but also acceptance, not passivity, but respect for the cold's power. And in that space, they found a kind of strength, because when everything can be lost, everything matters, a warm spoon, a shared cloak, a surviving ember, a name remembered. They did not expect to defeat winter, only to outlast it one day at a time, for as long as they could, and that, in the end, is what makes their survival so profound. Not that they endured with technology, but that they endured with will, with ritual, and with each other. 15. The thaw. What survival meant when the cold finally broke, it didn't arrive with fanfare. The thaw never did. No trumpets, no triumph, just the subtle drip of melting icicles, the creak of frozen earth loosening, and a silence so deep it almost hurt. But to the medieval peasant, it was a sound more beautiful than bells, the sound of survival. When the cold finally broke, it wasn't a celebration. It was a slow, aching exhale after months of holding your breath. It was the return of time. The first signs were sensory. You didn't need a calendar to know spring was near. You could smell it, the scent of mud, manure, and sap. You could feel it underfoot as the ground turned from stone to sponge. And in your joints, no longer clenched against frost, there was space again. Room to stretch, to move, to hope. Inside the home, the changes were immediate. Blankets were shaken out and aired. The hearth wasn't allowed to go cold, but it was allowed to rest. Embers weren't stoked so aggressively. Coats were hung near the door instead of worn to sleep. The door was cracked open for a few minutes each day, not just for fresh air, but for the confirmation that the world hadn't died. Food shifted to. The cellar was nearly empty. Yes, but now the meals were laced with anticipation. The last onion was precious. The final chunk of cheese divided with reverence. The pottage thinned, stretched with water and herbs, not because there was enough, but because soon there would be. Dandelion greens would appear. Nettles, sorrel, chickweed. They weren't luxuries. They were first signs of grace. Work changed. Tempo. Not more or less, just different. Tools were pulled from storage. Broken fences mended. Roofs patched. But it was done without dread. After weeks of survival mode, even hard labor felt like liberation. You could stand outside without your bones turning to glass. You could walk across the village without leaving steam behind. But here's what few talk about. Survivor's guilt existed even then. The thaw revealed not only earth but loss. You saw who made it and who didn't. Which homes had smoke and which didn't. Who returned to the bakehouse and who would never again. And that grief was worn not in black, but in silence, in nods, in extra help offered without being asked. The community didn't talk about death. They carried it forward, making sure the next winter didn't claim as many. And perhaps that's why the thaw was so bittersweet, because it didn't just mean warmth, it meant reckoning. The weight of what had been endured, the quiet tally of what had been lost, but also the strength revealed, the small triumphs, the fire that never went out, the neighbor who shared to, much wood, the child who kept singing. The meal stretched one day further than you thought possible. The thaw was not a parade. It was a resurrection, a slow rebuilding, a quiet promise, and with it came rituals, Candlemas, spring festivals, seed blessings. These weren't superstitions. They were affirmations. That light returned. That wounds healed. That life still wanted to go on. And so they went on, day by day, replanting, repairing, remembering, because that's what survival truly was, not just staying alive, but knowing how to begin again. 16. The last ember. What medieval winters teach us about ourselves? We live now in a world of thermostats and touch screens, where winter means layering up a delivery app and complaining about the wind through double-pane glass. We measure discomfort in minutes, not months. But behind us, beneath every modern comfort there is a trail of embers. And if we look closely enough at how medieval peasants survived the coldest nights, we don't just find history, we find ourselves, stripped down, softened, human. Because the truth is, what they endured was more than frost and famine. It was limitation, a kind we rarely experience today. Their lives were ruled by firelight and the body's signals, by shared hardship and the softness of wool. And in that hardship, something beautiful was born, a philosophy of survival built, not on individual strength, but on interdependence, adaptation, and rhythm. We look at their lives and see suffering. They looked at their lives and saw systems that worked, systems where heat was shared, where time bent to light, where animals slept beside children and stories warmed the soul. Systems that weren't perfect but were enough. They teach us that comfort isn't just about warmth. It's about knowing what matters when everything else falls away. A full belly, a warm back, a kind neighbor, the discipline to wake up and check the coals, the humility to sleep beside livestock, the grace to offer food from your last root. They weren't trying to thrive. They were trying to stay. And in doing so, they preserved something we've almost forgotten, the profound value of enough. Their winters were brutal, but they weren't passive victims. They were engineers of survival. Their homes, diets, and rituals were all part of an invisible technology of resilience far more advanced in its way than any app or appliance we've invented, because it required not electricity, but wisdom, not convenience, but connection. And maybe that's what we're starving for now. Not heat, but meaning. Not escape, but grounding. When our lights go out, when the power grid fails, when the world feels cold in more ways than temperature, we do well to remember the people Who didn't panic when the cold came? They prepared, they endured, they shared, and when the thaw came, they mourned their losses, counted their blessings, and planted again. We are descended not from the strongest, but from the most adaptable, the ones who learned how to find warmth in unexpected places, in the breath of a cow, in the pressure of another's back, in a well-fed gut, in a story told between sleep cycles. That knowledge lives in us, even now. It's in your bones, in your gut, waiting. And it's not weakness to admit the cold gets in. It's only weakness to forget that we already know how to survive it. So, the next time you pull on a sweater, or curse a cold morning, pause. Think of the woman adding moss to her daughter's shoes. Think of the man wrapping a stone in cloth before bed. Think of the child waking during the night to gently turn the coals. They didn't just survive winter. They partnered with it. And in doing so, they left us more than stories. They left us a blueprint. One last ember, still glowing.